Hi, thank you for joining me. My name is Mindy Mandell. This video is part of a series of videos on Proclus's Elements of Theology. And today's video is going to focus on propositions 31 through 35. Now, as I've been doing throughout the series, I am using the E.R. Dodds translation. For those of you who don't have this book, there is a link in the description box for a PDF version. Now, the propositions we've been looking at recently deal with remaining, proceeding, and reverting. We saw proposition 26, for example, described remaining, that the cause remains steadfast in itself. It doesn't change as its effect proceeds from it. We also saw that procession comes through likeness. That likeness is the generative principle of the universe. And we also saw that what proceeds also a little bit remains in its cause. That was propositions 28 through 30. Today, coming from proposition 31, we're going to look at reversion. And then we're going to culminate this video with proposition 35, which puts the three together. In order to appreciate the reasoning that he's going to use in 31 through 35, we do need to remember something that came up earlier. So propositions 8 through 12 introduced the good as the first principle. And one of the main points there that comes up repeatedly, I'm only using proposition 8 as an example here, but it comes up repeatedly, propositions 8 through 12, is the idea that all things which exist desire their good. This idea comes up again and again. So if you're keeping a list of terminology that goes with one or with good, any idea about desiring or having appetition, that upward tension that we've seen in some of the other propositions, all deals with the idea of the good. Okay, and with this idea in mind, let's jump into proposition 31. So 31 states that all that proceeds from any principle reverts in respect of its being upon that from which it proceeds. And here's the reasoning. If it should proceed, yet not revert upon the cause of this procession, it must be without appetition of that cause, since all that has appetition is turned towards the object of its appetite. Okay, so there's that idea from proposition 8. But all things desire the good, and each attains it through the mediation of its own proximate cause. Therefore, each has appetition of its own cause also. And we saw back in proposition 8 that each thing desires its good. And so its immediate cause is its good. And now we're seeing that it's through the mediation of those lower causes that everything has that upward tension towards the good. Through that which gives its being, it attains its well-being. And the source of its well-being is the primary object of its appetite. And the primary object of its appetite is that upon which it reverts. So coming back to our triad then, we see that the effect proceeds out of the cause and then reverts back to that from which it proceeded. Okay, moving on, proposition 32 is adding the idea that it is likeness that explains this reversion. So just as we saw that likeness was key to understanding procession, it is also key in reversion. All reversion is accomplished through a likeness of the reverting terms to the goal of reversion. For that which reverts endeavors to be conjoined in every part with every part of its cause, and it desires to have communion in it and be bound to it. But all things are bound together by likeness. Key phrase there in understanding Platonic metaphysics. All things are bound together by likeness. As by unlikeness they are distinguished and severed. If then reversion is a communion and a conjunction, and all communion and conjunction is through likeness, then it follows that all reversion must be accomplished through likeness. Now what Proclus is going to add is the idea of a cyclic activity, and this is proposition 33. All that proceeds from any principle and reverts upon it has a cyclic activity. For if it reverts upon that principle whence it proceeds, which was what we saw in proposition 31, then that links its end to its beginning, and the movement is one and continuous, originating from the unmoved and to the unmoved again returning. The unmoved again would be that cause. Thus all things proceed in a circuit, from their causes, plural, to their causes again. And there are some greater circuits and there are lesser circuits, in that some revert upon their immediate priors, others upon the superior causes, even to the beginning of all things. And here we get a nice mystical sounding conclusion. Out of the beginning all things are, and towards it all revert. So now, because we're moving through multiple causes, we may replace our triangle imagery with something more of a circuit. Although with a circuit, then the proceeding points are different from the returning points, and so we may have something more like this. Now notice he said that all things return to the beginning of all. And we saw in some of the previous propositions that the principles that we are working with in our current propositions, in these last few weeks of propositions, they imitate the first cause of all. And because they imitated the one or the good, it meant that there are certain things that were implied about these later principles. And if that is true, that they imitate one another, or that the lower ones rather imitate the higher, and we can therefore infer things about the lower, it means that if whatever we say about the lower, because it's an imitation of the higher, we can also say about the one or the good. And so we can see the circuit leading not only to the highest of the existence, but even to the one or the good, because all things ultimately have that upper tension to the one or the good. Here's a quick example of a proposition which mentioned the idea of the principles imitating the one originative principle of the universe, the one or the good. Proposition 25 actually included this idea in the very proposition. Some of the later propositions, such as 26, also included the idea in the explanation, so you can find it throughout. Okay, so we ended proposition 35 with this very beautiful image. Out of the beginning all things are, and towards it all revert. Now let's go on to proposition 34. This one states that everything whose nature it is to revert, reverts upon that from which it derived the procession of its own substance. Basically, this one is just nailing down the idea that it is the same causes that it proceeded through which it also reverts. It is the same points, if you will. For if it reverts by nature, it has existential appetition of that upon which it reverts. And if so, then its being also is wholly dependent on the principle upon which it reverts existentially, and in its existence it resembles this latter. Hence, it is naturally sympathetic with this principle, since it is akin to it in existence. So remember the idea that likeness not only is the principle through which all things proceed, but also through which all things revert. And this being so, either the being of the two is identical, or one is derived from the other, or else both have received their like character from a single third principle. So cause and effect, those are the two. Now, if they be identical, how comes it that one is by nature reverted upon the other? And if the two are from one source, then that source would be the goal of natural reversion for both, as in proposition 31. So it remains, therefore, that one has its being from the other, and if so, then its procession is from that upon which it naturally reverts. So again, that image of the circuits where they're going through the same points. Now, there's a corollary here, which maybe on the surface seems like a stretch, but let's take a look at it and see why it follows. From this, it is apparent that as the intelligence, or some of you may use the word intelligible, as it is an object of appetition to all things, so all things proceed from the intelligence, and the whole world order, though eternal, has its being therefrom. The eternity of the world order affords no ground for denying that it proceeds from the intelligence, just as it keeps its own station forever, yet is nonetheless reverted upon the intelligence. It proceeds eternally, and it is eternal in its being. It is eternally reverted, and is steadfast in its own station. So he's saying that this circuit, in terms of all that exists, the highest, it must lead all to the highest of existence. All things have appetition for the intelligible. Why is this so? It may seem like a bold statement, but it's one that Proclus can make, because back at Proposition 20, he told us that beyond all bodies is the soul's essence, beyond all souls the intellective principle, which in this latest Proposition 34 he's calling the intelligence, and beyond all intellective substances is the one. And so what he's calling here the intellect, or what we often call the intelligible or the intelligence, this is the highest of the existence. And so that circuit must lead to that. But we can actually even take it a step further, as I was saying a moment before, that because the intelligence imitates the one or the good, and all things ultimately have appetition for the good, we can even carry it further and say that the circuit ultimately leads to the one or the good itself. And this will help us better understand Proposition 35, or the significance of Proposition 35. Proposition 35 is actually going to take us back to our triad and put the three terms together. So he has to show how they function together. And to do this, he's going to first consider, what if it's only one of them, only remaining, or only proceeding, or only reverting? Why does that not work? Why is it incomplete? What if you had two of them, only remaining and proceeding, or only proceeding and reverting? And so then he's going to look at two of them and see why that also is incomplete. When you see that, you see how the three together make it complete. And if it's complete, then it also, we can infer that we don't need a fourth, because you only have to add something else if it is incomplete, right? When it's just one, it's incomplete. When it's two, it's incomplete. But when we have three, it is now complete. And so we see why these three function together. Proposition 35. Every effect remains in its cause. Remember Proposition 30. To the degree that they're similar, the effect remains in its cause. To the degree that the effect is different, well, I stumbled over my words there. To the degree that the effect is different, it proceeds. All right, so every effect remains in its cause, proceeds from it, and also reverts upon it. So first he's going to consider just one of the three. What if it should remain? No procession, no reversion. Then it will be without distinction from, and therefore identical with its cause, since distinction implies procession. Again, we saw that in Proposition 30. Now, what if it should proceed only? No reversion, no immanence. Here the word immanence is being used synonymous with remaining. Then it would be without conjunction or sympathy with its cause, since it will have no communication with it. So it's just like something floating away, right? There's no remaining, no reversion. It's just floating off. Now, what if it should revert? No immanence, no procession. Well, how can that which has not its being from the higher revert existentially upon a principle thus alien? So now we're seeing why he had to introduce the idea of likeness in that return, in that appetition for the cause, in order to, that's really building up to this proposition to show why we need the three terms. Now he's going to consider just two of them. So we saw that just one alone is incomplete. How about if you had two of the terms? Well, first, what if it should remain and proceed, but not revert? in this case, we have to ask, how comes it that each thing has a natural appetition of its well-being and of the good, and an upward tension towards its begetter? So, in other words, our metaphysics should explain our experiences and our understandings of the nature of reality. And there is this upward tension, there is this appetite, this desire for the good. And so there must be reversion. Now, what if it should proceed and revert, but not remain? In that case, we have to ask, how comes it that being parted from its cause, it endeavors to be conjoined with it? Although before the severance, there was no conjunction. In other words, if it didn't remain, there's no likeness to that original cause. And if there's no likeness there, then why would it want to revert to that? And so we're seeing that when you have only two of the terms, there's something incomplete there. The final example of this is if it should remain and revert, but not proceed. Well, this one I think is pretty easy to see. If it remains, then that means that it can't revert, because it has to move away before it can revert back. And so he asks, how can there be reversion without distinction, since all reversion seems to be the resolution of a principle into something from which its being divides? And so now to conclude, he's going to show us that it can't be just one of them and it can't be just two of them, but when we have all three together, now we have something complete. He says the effect must either remain simply or revert simply or proceed simply. We eliminated those. Or it must combine either the extreme terms or combine the mean term proceeding with one of the other two. We eliminated all that. The only remaining possibility then is to combine all three. And also we can infer from this that because this was complete, that therefore we don't need a fourth term. And so his conclusion then is that every effect remains in its cause, proceeds from it, and reverts upon it. And so this is showing us that circuit, if you will, of remaining, proceeding, and reverting. But again, because these principles, because they imitate the first cause of all, then we can even apply this to the one or the good. Now there's an image here that the effect remains in its cause, it proceeds and it reverts, and it's proceeding and reverting and remaining and proceeding and reverting. You almost have like the image of breathing. It's like all that exists is like breathing, not only out of the intelligible, but even you can apply this to the first cause of all. And this is like a really profound image that when you sit with this, to see like all that exists is just like the one or the good, the first cause breathing. It's that imagery of it breathing. It all existence proceeds out and returns and proceeds out and returns. And that's the image that is painted here when you bring in Proposition 35. So you have to also tie it together with everything else and see that whole circuit, that whole string of causes, and how it all breathes out ultimately from that first cause. So I do hope you found that helpful. If you did, I would appreciate you hitting the like button, and also please subscribe if you don't already. I will be continuing these videos. I'm going to go through all 211 of the elements of theology. If you do have any questions or comments, feel free to leave those in the comments section, or also in the description box there is an email address if you have a longer question that you would like me to address. So thank you very much. I do hope that you'll join me next time.